The potato salad slipped from my hands and hit the deck with a wet splatter as my sister-in-law's voice cut through the backyard chatter like a blade. "Oh, look everyone. Maya's having another one of her little episodes. What is it this time? PTSD from filing paperwork." The laughter that followed felt like shrapnel, but it was nothing compared to the moment 15 seconds later when a voice behind me went ice cold and said, "What did you just call her?" I turned to see my sister-in-law's face drain of color as her father, retired Navy SEAL Commander James Mitchell, stared at the tattoo on my forearm. "The one with my call sign. Raven," he whispered, and the entire barbecue went silent. "You're Raven." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I had been standing at the outdoor grill station, balancing a paper plate loaded with barbecue chicken and my brother's famous potato salad, trying to remain invisible at what was supposed to be a casual family gathering. The June afternoon in suburban Sacramento stretched hot and bright around my brother Derek's newly renovated backyard, complete with the kind of elaborate outdoor kitchen that screamed upper-middle-class comfort. His wife Sienna had spent the better part of 3 weeks planning this barbecue, though planning might be too generous a word for what amounted to orchestrating a performance designed to showcase their recently completed home renovations and her position as the family's social coordinator. I had arrived exactly when Derek asked me to, carrying the dessert I had been assigned to bring, and wearing the kind of casual sundress that I hoped would help me blend into the background of pastel-clad relatives and Derek's work colleagues from the tech company where he served as a senior product manager. The gathering included approximately 30 people, a mix of family members I saw only at obligatory holiday gatherings and Sienna's extended family, most of whom I had never met. Among the unfamiliar faces were Sienna's parents, James and Patricia Mitchell, who had flown in from Virginia for a 2-week visit that coincided with this barbecue. I had been introduced to them briefly upon arrival, a quick handshake and smile before Sienna whisked them away to admire the new pergola or the custom fire pit or whatever feature of the backyard was currently demanding attention. James Mitchell was a tall man in his early 60s with steel gray hair cut military short, and the kind of posture that never fully relaxes even in civilian clothes. Patricia was elegant and warm, immediately putting me at ease with genuine interest in how I was settling back into civilian life. That 5-minute conversation represented the longest anyone in Derek's social circle had engaged with me about anything substantive in the 6 months since I had moved back to Sacramento. The previous 18 months had been a period of profound adjustment. I had separated from the Air Force after 12 years of service, the last 8 spent in a career field that I could not discuss in detail at family barbecues or anywhere else outside of secured facilities with people who held the appropriate clearances. My military service had taken me to places that did not appear on any itinerary I could share with my family, doing work that had earned me a call sign, a chest full of medals I kept in a drawer, and the kind of skills that translated poorly to civilian job descriptions. Since returning to California, I had been working as a logistics coordinator for a mid-sized distribution company, a job that paid adequately and required approximately 15% of my cognitive capacity. My days consisted of optimizing shipping routes, managing inventory databases, and attending meetings about process improvements that could have been emails. The work was fine. It was stable and predictable and caused me no stress whatsoever, which was precisely what my transition counselor had suggested I seek for my first civilian position. "Give yourself time to decompress," she had said. "Find something that lets you remember what normal feels like." What normal felt like, apparently, was being systematically dismissed by my sister-in-law at every family gathering. Sienna had entered our family 5 years ago, when she and Derek married in an elaborate ceremony at a Napa Valley vineyard that had cost more than my annual military salary. She came from money, the kind of family wealth that was never explicitly discussed but manifested in casual references to summer homes and boarding schools and parents who retired early to pursue philanthropic interests. She was beautiful in the way that requires significant maintenance, always impeccably dressed and made up, her home decorated with the kind of carefully curated aesthetic that suggested an interior designer had been involved. From the beginning, Sienna had seemed uncertain how to categorize me. I did not fit neatly into her understanding of family roles or social dynamics. I was Derek's younger sister by 4 years, which should have made me someone she befriended or mentored, but I had spent my adult life in a world completely foreign to her experience. During my years of active service, I had attended family events sporadically, appearing for major holidays when leave permitted and then disappearing back to assignments I could not discuss. I had missed their engagement party because I was deployed to a location I could not name. I had attended their wedding on emergency leave, staying for 3 days before returning to my unit. Sienna's few attempts to connect with me during those years had foundered on the reality that we had virtually nothing in common. She worked in marketing for a boutique firm, planning campaigns for lifestyle brands and luxury products. Her conversation revolved around social media strategies, influencer partnerships, and the complex politics of her office. My conversation revolved around nothing I was permitted to discuss in unclassified settings with people who lacked need-to-know clearance. After I separated from the military and moved back to the Sacramento area, I had hoped that increased proximity might improve our relationship. Instead, it seemed to make things worse. Perhaps when I was an occasional visitor in uniform, I represented something Sienna could romanticize or at least categorize cleanly. But as a permanent local presence working an unremarkable civilian job, I became something else entirely in her assessment, a project that had failed to launch, a woman in her early 30s with no husband, no children, no career trajectory that made sense in her framework, and no apparent ambition to acquire any of these markers of success. The comments had started subtly at first, little observations wrapped in concern. "You must be so relieved to have a normal job now," she had said at Easter dinner, her tone suggesting that my previous career had been some kind of unfortunate detour. "Are you dating anyone? You're not getting any younger. And I know some nice guys from Derek's company who might be interested if you're ready to settle down." At a family birthday dinner for our mother, she had asked loudly across the table whether I was making decent money now, or if the transition to civilian work had been a financial step down. Each comment carried the implication that my military service had been something vaguely embarrassing or at minimum impractical, and that my current situation represented some kind of failure to thrive. She seemed genuinely puzzled by my lack of urgency to climb a corporate ladder, find a husband, buy a house in an appropriate neighborhood, and otherwise demonstrate the markers of success she understood. The fact that I lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment, drove a 10-year-old sedan, and seemed content with a job that was nowhere near the top of any organizational chart appeared to confirm her assessment that I lacked proper ambition or direction. Derek, to his credit, had made a few half-hearted attempts to redirect Sienna's comments when he noticed them, but he did so in the way of someone trying to keep peace rather than someone genuinely defending me. Brief interventions followed by subject changes that left the underlying attitudes unchallenged. He loved his wife and wanted to maintain harmony in his household, which I understood. I had never asked him to choose between us or to make family gatherings into battlegrounds. I had simply absorbed the comments, responded with non-committal pleasantries, and left these events feeling progressively more alienated from my own family. My parents, who lived 2 hours north in a retirement community near Lake Tahoe, attended these gatherings infrequently enough that they missed most of Sienna's commentary. On the occasions when they were present and a comment registered, my mother would look uncomfortable and change the subject while my father would retreat into conversation with whoever was sitting nearest him. They were conflict-averse people who had raised their children to be polite and accommodating, values that served everyone except the person being accommodated against. So I had fallen into a pattern of attending these family obligations, staying for the minimum time that courtesy required, and then escaping back to my quiet apartment where I could exist without commentary or assessment. I told myself it did not matter, that I did not need Sienna's approval or understanding, that I was building a civilian life on my own terms and her opinions were irrelevant to that process. Mostly I believed this, but there were moments when her dismissiveness landed harder than I wanted to admit, touching on insecurities about whether I had made the right choice in separating from the military, whether my transition was proceeding as successfully as it should, whether I was wasting the skills and experience I had spent over a decade developing. This particular barbecue had been in progress for approximately 90 minutes when the incident occurred. I had been doing my usual strategy of helpful participation without drawing attention, offering to assist with food prep, refilling drinks, clearing plates, the kind of background support that kept me occupied and useful without requiring me to navigate conversations where I had little to contribute. The other guests were discussing topics I had no entry point into, renovations in school districts and upcoming vacations to destinations I had never visited for pleasure. I had just finished helping Sienna's mother Patricia arrange the dessert table when I went to collect another serving of food. The potato salad Derek had made was excellent, and I had been genuinely enjoying it, which was why I was returning for seconds. I was standing at the grill station, using tongs to add chicken to my plate, when I heard Sienna's voice rise above the general conversation. Honestly, I don't understand why Maya even bothers coming to these things. She just stands around looking uncomfortable and never talks to anyone. It's like she's afraid of normal human interaction. She was speaking to a cluster of her friends from her book club, women in their late 20s and early 30s who were gathered near the new outdoor bar that Derek had installed. Her voice carried clearly across the deck in that way that suggested she either did not care if I heard or actively wanted me to. I felt heat rise to my face but continued serving myself potato salad with careful focus, pretending I had not heard. This was standard management strategy: ignore provocation, do not escalate, remove yourself from the situation when possible. I would finish making my plate, eat quickly, and then invent a reason I needed to leave early. Simple exit strategy. But Sienna was not finished. 12 years in the military, and what does she have to show for it? A boring logistics job she's completely overqualified for. And no social skills whatsoever. I've tried to help her, I really have. I've introduced her to people, invited her to events, but she's just so awkward. Derek thinks I should be more patient with her, but honestly, at some point you have to just accept that some people are never going to be normal. One of her friends murmured something I could not hear, and Sienna laughed. No, she wasn't anything impressive. I think she did some kind of administrative work or something. She's really vague about it, which usually means it wasn't anything special. Probably filed paperwork at some desk job and now wants everyone to think she's some kind of hero. Classic military exaggeration. The potato salad dish was suddenly very heavy in my hands. My vision narrowed slightly at the edges, and I recognized the physiological response for what it was: adrenaline spike, elevated heart rate, the body preparing for threat response. I took a deliberate breath, using the techniques that had been drilled into me during stress management training. This was not a threat environment. This was just someone being cruel at a barbecue. I did not need to respond. I could simply leave. But my hands were shaking now, which made securing the serving spoon back into the potato salad dish difficult. The dish wobbled slightly as I tried to set it down, and in that moment of imperfect motor control, it slipped from my grip. The ceramic bowl hit the wooden deck with a crash that seemed impossibly loud, potato salad splattering across the boards and onto my sandals. The conversation stopped. Everyone turned to look at me standing there with potato salad at my feet, and my face burning with humiliation. And in that moment of sudden attention, Sienna's voice cut through the silence with false concern layered over unmistakable mockery. Oh, look everyone. Maya's having another one of her little episodes. What is it this time? PTSD from filing paperwork. The laughter started immediately from her cluster of friends. That performative mean girl laughter that signals pack solidarity more than genuine amusement. A few other guests shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Derek looked stricken but frozen, caught between defending me and managing his wife's mood. I stood there unable to move, unable to speak, the humiliation complete and total. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And then a voice behind me went absolutely cold. What did you just call her? I turned to see James Mitchell, Sienna's father, standing approximately 10 feet away near the outdoor kitchen island where he had apparently been making himself a drink. His entire demeanor had transformed from the relaxed retiree I had met earlier into something else entirely. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up in recognition. This was command presence, the kind that makes people stand at attention without conscious thought. Sienna's smile faltered. Dad, I was just joking around. Maya knows I'm kidding. I asked you a question. His voice had not risen in volume, but the temperature of the entire gathering had dropped noticeably. What did you just call your sister-in-law? I just said she was having an episode. It was just a joke about her PTSD from filing paperwork. James Mitchell set down his glass with the kind of careful control that suggested significant effort to maintain composure. That's what you said. About a woman who served 12 years in the United States Air Force. He was walking toward me now, and I found myself standing at attention without consciously choosing to, muscle memory from 12 years of military service overriding civilian casualness. He stopped directly in front of me, his eyes moving from my face down to my left forearm where my tattoo was partially visible beneath the short sleeve of my sundress. I have 3 tattoos, all small and all placed where they could be concealed by professional attire when necessary. The one on my left forearm is simple, just a silhouette of a raven in flight with my service dates underneath in small numbers. Most people who notice it assume it is simply a bird tattoo, decorative and meaningless. But James Mitchell was not most people. His eyes locked on that tattoo and then rose slowly back to my face, and I watched recognition dawn in his expression followed by something that looked like shock. "Raven," he said quietly, and the way he said it made clear he was not commenting on the tattoo's imagery. "You're Raven." The backyard had gone completely silent. Every conversation had stopped. Every eye was on us. I met his gaze directly and gave a slight nod. "Yes, sir." James Mitchell took a step back, and I watched him reassess everything he thought he knew about me in the space of approximately 3 seconds. His eyes moved from the tattoo to my face to my posture and back again, and whatever he was seeing was causing a reaction I had not anticipated. "Jesus Christ," he said softly and then louder, addressing the entire gathering. "Does anyone here know who Raven is?" Silence. Confused looks. Sienna looking between us with growing unease as she recognized that something was happening outside her control or understanding. "Raven," James Mitchell continued, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made people listen whether they wanted to or not, "is a call sign. In the military, call signs are earned. They're given to you by your unit, usually your fellow operators, and they stick with you throughout your career and beyond. You don't get a call sign for filing paperwork." He turned to face Sienna directly. "You get a call sign when you do something extraordinary, when you prove yourself in situations that matter, when your actions in the field earn the respect of people whose respect is not easily given." Sienna had gone pale. "Dad, I didn't know." "You didn't bother to know," he corrected sharply. "You made assumptions and then you mock someone based on those assumptions without ever once asking about their actual service record." He turned back to me. "What was your AFSC?" AFSC, Air Force Specialty Code, the numerical designation for your career field. Some numbers everyone recognizes because they are common medical maintenance administration. My number was not one of those. 1N4X1 Alpha, sir, I replied. With additional identifiers I can't discuss in an unclassified setting. I watched comprehension hit him. 1N4X1 Alpha is the code for Fusion Analyst Intelligence Operations. The additional identifiers I could not discuss indicated special access programs, compartmented information, the kind of work that happens in secured facilities and never gets detailed in casual conversation. It was work that had taken me all over the world, often to places experiencing active conflict. Work that had put me in situations where the analysis I provided affected operational outcomes and occasionally saved lives. James Mitchell nodded slowly. "How many deployments?" 7, sir. 6 to CENTCOM or 1 to AFRICOM. Combat zone. All 7, sir. Decorations. I hesitated. This was not information I generally shared because it tended to invite questions I could not answer about the specific circumstances that earned them. But something about this moment, about standing in my brother's backyard covered in potato salad while my sister-in-law and her friends stared at me, made me decide that evasion had stopped serving me. Meritorious Service Medal with 2 oak leaf clusters, Air Force Commendation Medal with Valor Device and 3 oak leaf clusters, Air Force Achievement Medal with Combat Device, Joint Service Achievement Medal, and some others that are associated with programs I'm not at liberty to discuss. The silence that followed was profound. Most civilians have no idea what these decorations mean, or what someone has to do to earn them. But James Mitchell, who had spent 30 years as a Navy SEAL including multiple tours as a team leader, and eventually a SEAL team commander, understood exactly what they meant. He understood that the Commendation Medal with Valor Device meant I had performed heroically under direct hostile fire. He understood that multiple service medals meant repeated recognition for significant achievements. He understood that decorations I could not discuss meant black programs, special access, the kind of work that stays classified for decades. "How long have you been out?" he asked quietly. 18 months, sir. Why do you separate? This question was more complicated, and I had answered it dozens of times during transition counseling, exit interviews, and well-meaning conversations with people trying to understand why someone would leave after 12 years when retirement benefits vest at 20. The simple answer was that I had reached a point where continuing to serve would have required sacrifices I was no longer willing to make to my physical health, my mental health, and my ability to eventually build a life outside the military. The complex answer involved operational tempo, cumulative stress, relationships that had failed under the pressure of repeated deployments, and the growing awareness that I had given the military everything I had to give and needed to preserve something of myself for whatever came next. It was time, sir, I said simply. I'd given what I could give. He nodded with the understanding of someone who had faced similar calculations. Landing okay? Getting there, sir. It's an adjustment. James Mitchell turned to face the assembled guests, and when he spoke his voice carried command authority that made everyone present sit up straighter whether they had military experience or not. This woman, he said, gesturing to me, spent 12 years conducting intelligence operations in combat zones that most of you cannot imagine and will never be required to understand. She did work that directly supported combat operations, that saved American lives, that contributed to national security in ways that will remain classified probably for the rest of your lives. She earned the respect of her units, earned a call sign, earned multiple combat decorations, and when she separated from service, she did so with honor. He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. And she just stood here and listened to someone mock her service, dismiss her experience, and suggest that 12 years of sacrifice and dedication to her country amounted to filing paperwork. Someone who has never spent a single day in uniform, never missed a holiday with family because she was deployed to a combat zone, never carried the weight of knowing that the analysis she provided might mean the difference between operators coming home alive or in a box. He turned to Sienna, and his voice went cold again. You will apologize to your sister-in-law. Now, Sienna looked like she wanted the ground to open and swallow her. Her face had gone from pale to flushed, her carefully applied makeup suddenly unable to conceal the blotchiness of extreme embarrassment. Her friends had all taken sudden interest in their drinks or phones, distancing themselves from association with her comments. I'm sorry, she managed, her voice small. Maya, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. You didn't ask, James Mitchell interrupted. That's the problem. You made assumptions, you created a narrative based on your limited understanding, and you never once bothered to actually learn about the person you were judging. He looked around at the other guests, many of whom were now avoiding eye contact. That goes for everyone here. How many of you have asked Maya about her service? How many of you have shown any interest in what she did, where she went, what she experienced? How many of you have said thank you for her service and actually meant it as more than a polite phrase? Silence. Uncomfortable shifting. People suddenly finding reasons to check their phones or refill drinks or move to different areas of the yard. James Mitchell turned back to me, and his expression softened considerably. I apologize for my daughter's behavior. There's no excuse for it. And I apologize that you've apparently been dealing with this kind of dismissal from people who should know better. It's all right, sir, I said automatically, defaulting to the military training that teaches you to smooth over conflict and maintain unit cohesion, even when things are not actually all right. No, he said firmly, it's not all right, and you don't have to pretend it is. Something about the way he said that, the permission to acknowledge that I had been hurt, and that the hurt was legitimate, hit me harder than Sienna's mockery had. I felt my throat tighten and had to look away to maintain composure. Patricia Mitchell materialized beside me with a handful of napkins. Let's get you cleaned up, sweetheart, she said gently, and her kindness after the preceding humiliation nearly undid me completely. Derek finally found his voice. Maya, I'm so sorry. I should have said something earlier. I should have shut this down a long time ago. I looked at my brother, seeing genuine regret in his face mixed with shame that he had let it get to this point. It's okay, I started to say, but James Mitchell cut me off again. Stop saying it's okay when it's not. You're allowed to be angry. You're allowed to expect better from your family. He was right. I was angry. I had been absorbing these dismissals and microaggressions for months, telling myself they did not matter, that I was being too sensitive, that I should just ignore it and maintain family harmony. But they did matter. Every comment had landed like small cuts, accumulating until I was walking around perpetually braced for the next one. I think, I said carefully, I'm going to head home now. Like hell you are, James Mitchell said. You're going to stay, you're going to eat, and you're going to let people here actually get to know you instead of whatever cartoon character they've been imagining. And anyone who has a problem with that can leave instead. Patricia linked her arm through mine. He's right. Plus, I want to hear about your deployments if you're willing to share what you can. Jim has told me so many stories over the years, but I always love hearing different perspectives. I looked around the backyard. Sienna had disappeared into the house, presumably to compose herself or hide. Her friends were quietly gathering their things to leave, but other guests were watching with expressions ranging from curiosity to shame to genuine interest. My brother was standing awkwardly by the grill, clearly wanting to approach but unsure whether he would be welcome. James Mitchell was still standing at attention beside me, and I realized that in his mind he was running interference, using his authority and credibility to reset the social dynamics of this gathering and force people to actually see me instead of whatever assumptions they had been operating under. Part of me wanted to leave anyway, to escape back to my apartment and the solitude where I did not have to navigate other people's perceptions and judgments. But another part of me, the part that had spent 12 years refusing to quit even when things were hard, recognized that leaving now would be allowing Sienna's narrative to stand. It would be confirming that I was fragile, uncomfortable, unable to handle social situations, all the things she had accused me of being. Okay, I said quietly. I'll stay. James Mitchell smiled, and it transformed his entire face from intimidating authority figure to something warm and genuinely pleased. Outstanding. Now someone get this woman a fresh plate of food and a drink, and let's start this barbecue over with everyone on the same page about who they're actually dealing with. What followed over the next 2 hours was a complete recalibration of how I existed within my own family's social sphere. James Mitchell had essentially issued a command that people actually engage with me as a full human being rather than the vague background figure I had been allowed to become, and his authority combined with the shock of the earlier revelation meant that people actually complied. Patricia stayed close initially, her presence serving as both comfort and social lubricant, as various guests approached with expressions ranging from sheepish to genuinely curious. She had a gift for making people feel at ease, even when they were clearly uncomfortable about their previous assumptions, asking questions that invited me to share what I felt comfortable sharing, while never pushing into territory that might be classified or painful. The first person to approach after I had cleaned the potato salad off my sandals and composed myself was one of Derek's colleagues from the tech company, a man named Richard who I had been introduced to at least 3 previous family gatherings and who had never remembered meeting me before. He came over with his wife Sarah, both of them looking awkward but determined. Maya, I owe you an apology, Richard said without preamble. I've met you multiple times and never bothered to actually talk with you beyond pleasantries. I'm ashamed to say I didn't even realize you were military until just now. His wife nodded in agreement. We'd love to hear about your service if you're willing to share. What you're comfortable with, of course. This was the question I had been asked countless times since separating from the military, and it never got easier to answer. The nature of my work meant that most of what I had done remained classified at levels that would stay restricted for decades. I could not talk about specific operations, specific analysis I had provided, specific locations where I had worked, or specific outcomes that had resulted from intelligence my team had produced. What remained were generalities that often felt inadequate to convey the reality of the experience. But I had learned over the months since separation that people were generally asking about the experience of military service rather than operational details, and there were ways to be honest about that experience without compromising security. I worked in intelligence analysis. I began using the explanation I had refined through repetition. My job was to take information from multiple sources and analyze it to support combat operations. I did that primarily in support of special operations forces deployed in active combat zones. I can't talk about specific missions or outcomes, but I can tell you that the work mattered and the people I supported were among the most professional and capable individuals I've ever had the privilege to work alongside. Richard leaned forward with genuine interest. When you say combat zones, were you actually in danger yourself? This question always came up, usually from people trying to reconcile their mental image of intelligence work as something that happens in secure facilities far from actual fighting with the reality that modern warfare often does not respect those clean boundaries. Intelligence analysts in my specialty often deploy forward with the units we support, I explained. That means living and working in the same locations where combat operations are being conducted. We were on bases that took indirect fire regularly, we traveled on convoys that were subject to IED threats, and the nature of the work meant we were always aware that the analysis we provided would directly affect whether the operators we supported came home alive. The psychological weight of that responsibility was its own kind of danger. Sarah looked troubled. That sounds incredibly stressful. How did you cope with that for 12 years? It was a fair question and one I had spent considerable time exploring with the therapist I had been seeing since separation. The honest answer was that I had coped through a combination of compartmentalization, dark humor, intense focus on the mission, and the camaraderie of working with people who understood the stakes because they were living them too. I had also coped by sometimes not coping very well, by having relationships fail because I could not talk about what was consuming my mental energy, by coming home from deployments and needing weeks to remember how to exist in environments where nobody was trying to kill me, by gradually accumulating stress injuries that did not always manifest in obvious ways. You develop coping mechanisms, I said carefully. You focus on the mission and the people depending on you. You find meaning in the work itself. And you rely heavily on your team because they're the only ones who truly understand what you're experiencing. James Mitchell had been listening from a few feet away, and he nodded at this explanation. That's the double-edged sword of special operations community, he added. The bonds you form are stronger than almost anything else in life because they're forged in circumstances that test everything about who you are. But it also means that when you leave, you're separating from the only people who really understand what you've been through. Transition is hard for everyone, but it's particularly difficult for people coming out of intensive operational roles. This was the most succinctly anyone had ever articulated something I had been struggling to explain to myself. The transition from military to civilian life was challenging for all service members, but leaving a career in special operations support meant not just changing jobs but leaving behind an entire world of shared understanding and purpose. The people I had worked with for 12 years had known me in ways that my own family never had. They had seen me under stress, had trusted me with their lives in indirect but very real ways, had valued my contributions because those contributions had tangible operational consequences. In civilian life, I was starting over with no context, no shared vocabulary, and no way to adequately explain what I had done or why it mattered. The result was a profound sense of isolation that I had been managing with varying degrees of success for the past 18 months. Is that why you took a job that seems below your capability level? Richard asked, and I appreciated that he framed it as a question rather than a judgment. Derek mentioned you're doing logistics coordination, which seems like it would be pretty straightforward for someone with your analytical background. My transition counselor recommended taking something low stress for the first year or two, I said. After 12 years of high-pressure operational work, I needed something that would let me decompress and remember what it felt like to not constantly be operating at intense levels. The logistics job is fine for now. It pays adequately and it doesn't follow me home at night, which is valuable when you're relearning how to be a civilian. Patricia squeezed my arm gently. That sounds very wise. Too many people try to jump immediately into something intense and burn out. You're being strategic about your transition. More people approached over the following hour, some offering belated thanks for my service that felt genuine rather than perfunctory, others asking questions about military life or deployment experiences or what it was like being a woman in what they assumed was a male-dominated field. I found myself talking more than I had at any family gathering in recent memory, and while some conversations were superficial or awkward, others had unexpected depth. Derek's business partner Marcus turned out to be a Marine Corps veteran who had served in Iraq during the surge, and we fell into the kind of easy conversation that happens between people who share the common language of military experience. He understood without explanation what I meant when I talked about the difficulty of transitioning from an environment where everyone shared purpose and understood stakes to civilian workplaces where people complained about parking spaces and break room coffee. The hardest part for me was accepting that most people's problems are not actually problems, Marcus said quietly. Someone would be having a meltdown about a project deadline or a difficult client, And I'd be standing there thinking about guys I knew who died in Fallujah, and it took everything I had not to tell them their crisis was not actually a crisis. You learn to keep perspective to yourself because civilians don't want to hear it. I nodded emphatically. That's exactly it. You can't say those things without sounding like you're diminishing their experience or claiming some kind of moral superiority because you've seen combat. But internally you're constantly recalibrating what actually constitutes a problem worth stress, and the recalibration makes it hard to take civilian concerns seriously. Do you stay in touch with anyone from your units? He asked. This question hit harder than he probably intended. I did stay in touch with some people from my various assignments, but maintaining those connections was complicated by distance, by operational tempo that meant people were constantly deploying, and by the reality that many of those relationships had been forged in contexts that no longer existed. We could reminisce and check in periodically, but the intensity of shared experience that had bonded us was now in the past, and civilian life did not provide equivalent experiences to sustain the same depth of connection. Some, I said. But it's hard when everyone's scattered and still operating in a world I'm no longer part of. I get updates occasionally, see photos on social media of people at locations I recognize but can't comment on. It's like watching a life I used to live continue without me. Marcus nodded with understanding. Yeah, that's the thing nobody tells you about getting out. You think you're ready to leave, you make the decision for good reasons, but then you're on the outside and part of you is always wondering what you're missing. This was veering into territory that touched on questions I was still processing about whether I had made the right choice in separating, whether I should have pushed through to 20 years for retirement benefits, whether the transition difficulties I was experiencing were normal adjustment or indication that I had made a mistake. I redirected the conversation to safer ground by asking Marcus about his business with Derek, and we talked for another 20 minutes about the tech industry and the adjustment to civilian corporate culture. Throughout these conversations, I was acutely aware of Sienna's absence. She had disappeared into the house shortly after her father's intervention and had not re-emerged. Derek kept glancing toward the house with an expression of concern mixed with frustration, clearly torn between his duties as host and whatever was happening with his wife inside. I felt guilty about being the cause of marital tension, even though the rational part of my brain recognized that Sienna's behavior and her father's response were not my responsibility. James Mitchell seemed to sense my discomfort because he appeared at my elbow during a brief lull in conversation. Don't feel bad about Sienna, he said quietly. She needed that wake-up call, and better it came from me than from someone less invested in her growth as a person. I don't want to cause problems in Derek's marriage, I said. You didn't cause anything. Sienna's behavior caused this, and the consequences are hers to manage. Derek will be fine. And Sienna will survive being embarrassed. Might even learn something from it if she's capable of self-reflection, which I'm not entirely confident about, but I remain hopeful. There was a wry affection in how he said this that suggested complicated parental feelings about a daughter he loved but did not always respect. I wondered what it had been like for him, a man who had spent 30 years in the SEALs leading teams in some of the most dangerous environments imaginable, to raise a daughter who valued designer handbags and Instagram aesthetics above all else. Not that there was anything wrong with those interests, but the gulf between their worldviews must have created its own challenges. Can I ask you something? I said hesitantly. Anything. How did you know what the call sign meant? I mean, I know you recognized it as a call sign, but you seemed to understand immediately that it implied something significant. James smiled slightly. Because I know the community. Not Air Force specifically, but Special Operations is a small world across service branches. We all know that call signs get earned, and certain ones carry weight. Raven suggests someone who operates in darkness, who sees what others don't, who brings information from places others can't reach. Combined with your AFSC and your decoration record, it painted a pretty clear picture of someone who was doing serious work in serious places. He paused before continuing. I also recognized the look in your eyes when Sienna was mocking you. That was someone who has been to hard places and done hard things having to listen to someone who has never experienced real hardship dismiss their sacrifice. I've seen that look before in operators who come home and have to smile through civilians telling them war stories they saw in movies. It made me angry on your behalf. Thank you for intervening, I said quietly. I've been absorbing comments like that for months and telling myself they didn't matter. Having someone actually call it out and make it stop meant more than you probably realize. You shouldn't have had to absorb it in the first place. Your family should have shut that down long before it got to this point. He glanced toward the house where Sienna remained hidden. I'm going to have a longer conversation with my daughter about empathy and respect. She grew up with advantages that sometimes made it hard for her to recognize that other people's paths have value, even when they don't look like hers. That's my failure as a parent, and I'm going to address it. Patricia rejoined us carrying 3 bottles of beer. I thought we could all use one of these, she said, handing them out. Maya, I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to come to dinner with us sometime this week. Just the 3 of us, somewhere quiet where we can actually talk without the chaos of a party. Jim would love to hear more about your service, and frankly so would I. We're in town for another 10 days, and I'd like to get to know you better. The invitation was so genuinely warm and unexpected that I felt emotion rise in my throat. I'd like that very much. Good. Give me your number and we'll set it up. As I was exchanging contact information with Patricia, Derek finally approached. He looked exhausted and deeply uncomfortable, the kind of expression people wear when they know they have been complicit in something wrong and can no longer avoid addressing it. Maya, can we talk for a minute? He asked. Privately. I followed him to the far corner of the yard near the fence line where we were out of earshot from other guests. He ran his hand through his hair repeatedly, a nervous gesture he had had since childhood. I'm so sorry, he began. I should have said something months ago when Sienna started making comments. I told myself she didn't mean anything by it, that it was just her sense of humor, that you were strong enough to handle it. But that was bullshit and I know it. I was prioritizing my comfort and my marriage over defending my sister, and that's inexcusable. Derek, it's okay. Stop saying it's okay. Commander Mitchell was right. You keep saying things are okay when they're not, and that just lets everyone off the hook for treating you badly. It's not okay that my wife mocked your service. It's not okay that I let her do it repeatedly without serious consequences. It's not okay that I've barely asked you about your life or your transition or how you're actually doing since you moved back here. His voice was rising slightly, and I could see genuine distress in his face. You're my little sister. I'm supposed to look out for you. Instead, I've been so wrapped up in my own life, my career, my marriage, that I didn't even notice you were being systematically dismissed at every family gathering. What kind of brother does that make me? I had not expected this level of self-recrimination from Derek. We had never been particularly close growing up, separated by 4 years and very different interests. He had been the golden child in his own way, academically successful, professionally ambitious, following the traditional path our parents understood and approved of. I had been the kid who joined the Air Force at 18 because I had no idea what else to do with my life and needed structure and purpose. Our paths had diverged so completely that we had maintained only surface-level sibling connection over the years, checking in periodically but never really understanding each other's worlds. You're a brother who has his own life and responsibilities, I said. I don't expect you to defend me constantly. I'm an adult who can handle social discomfort. But you shouldn't have to, not from your own family. And especially not when the discomfort is based on complete ignorance about who you are and what you've done. He looked toward the house. Sienna is in there crying because she's embarrassed, and because her father ripped into her in front of everyone. Part of me feels bad for her because that was brutal to watch. But the other part of me is angry that she put herself in that position through her own behavior, and that I enabled it by not shutting it down earlier. What are you going to do? I asked. I'm going to have a serious conversation with my wife about respect and assumptions and the fact that my family is not negotiable. If she can't treat you with basic decency, then we have a marriage problem that needs addressing. He looked at me directly. I'm also going to make more effort to actually be present in your life, to ask real questions and listen to real answers instead of just going through the motions at family gatherings. You're going through a major transition and I've been completely absent for it, and that changes now. This was more emotional honesty than Derek and I had exchanged in years, possibly ever. I did not know quite how to respond to it. Part of me wanted to let him off the hook, to smooth things over and return to our comfortable surface-level relationship where nobody had to feel uncomfortable emotions. But James Mitchell's words echoed in my head about stopping the pattern of saying things were okay when they were not. I'd like that, I said simply. I could use more connection with family right now. The transition has been harder than I expected. And I've been pretty isolated. Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you tell me you were struggling? Because you didn't ask, and I didn't want to burden you with problems you couldn't fix. Your life seems so settled and successful. And mine feels like I'm stumbling around trying to figure out who I am without the military defining me. I didn't want to be the struggling younger sister who couldn't get her life together. Derek looked stricken. Maya, you're not struggling. You served 12 years in combat zones doing work that apparently impressed a retired SEAL commander, which I'm guessing is not easy to do. You transitioned out with honor and you're building a civilian life on your own terms. That's not failure. That's courage. It doesn't feel like courage. It feels like I'm barely keeping my head above water most days. That's what transition looks like for everyone. Supposed to be hard. You're rebuilding your entire identity and life structure. Give yourself more credit. He hesitated before continuing. For what it's worth, I've always admired that you went into the military. I took the safe path, college and corporate job, and following the template our parents laid out. You did something completely different, something that required actual bravery, and you stuck with it for over a decade. That takes guts I'm not sure I have. This perspective was so different from what I had always assumed Derek thought about my choices that it took me a moment to process. I had always believed he saw my military service the way our parents seemed to, as fine but not particularly impressive, something practical for people who did not have better options. Hearing that he actually admired it recalibrated my understanding of our relationship. Thank you, I managed. That means a lot. We stood there in slightly awkward silence for a moment before Derek pulled me into a hug. It was brief and somewhat clumsy because we were not a family that hugged frequently, but it felt genuine. I'm going to go check on Sienna, he said when he released me. But I want you to stay as long as you're comfortable. Don't leave because of her. You have more right to be here than her book club friends do. He headed toward the house, and I returned to the main gathering where Patricia immediately handed me a fresh beer and started telling me about a documentary she had watched about female pilots in World War II. The conversation was easy and interesting, and I found myself relaxing in a way I had not at previous family gatherings. Over the next hour, more people approached to talk, and I began to see how completely the dynamics had shifted. Where before I had been a vague background presence people acknowledged with brief pleasantries before moving on, I was now someone they actively sought out. Some of this was probably morbid curiosity or guilt about their previous dismissal, but some seemed genuinely motivated by interest in understanding someone whose experience was so far outside their own. One of Derek's neighbors, a woman named Jennifer who taught high school history, asked thoughtful questions about the geopolitical context of the regions where I had deployed, and how that informed my perspective on current events. One of Sienna's cousins, a college student studying international relations, wanted to know about intelligence analysis as a career field, and what advice I would give someone considering military service. Even some of the book club friends who had laughed at Sienna's mockery earlier approached with sheepish apologies and attempts at conversation. Through all of this, James Mitchell remained a quiet presence, observing but not dominating conversations, occasionally adding perspective from his own experience, and generally ensuring through his continued presence that people maintained the respectful engagement he had demanded. His wife Patricia moved through the gathering with the grace of someone accustomed to social leadership, connecting people and facilitating conversations, and generally serving as a social lubricant that kept things flowing smoothly. As the sun began setting and the gathering started to wind down, Sienna finally re-emerged from the house. Her makeup had been repaired and her composure restored to a degree, but she looked subdued in a way I had never seen before. She did not rejoin the main party but instead moved to the outdoor kitchen area where she began cleaning up with focused intensity that suggested she needed something to do with her hands. I debated whether to approach her or let her have space, ultimately deciding that continuing to avoid each other would just make future family gatherings more awkward. I picked up some empty plates and brought them over to where she was loading the dishwasher. "Can I help?" I asked quietly. She looked up, startled, and I saw that her eyes were still red from crying. "You don't have to do that." "I know, but I'm going to anyway because that's what people do at family gatherings. They help clean up." We worked in silence for a few minutes, establishing a rhythm of clearing and loading dishes. Finally, Sienna spoke without looking at me. "I really am sorry, Maya. Not just because my dad embarrassed me in front of everyone, but because I was genuinely cruel and I had no right to be. I made assumptions about you based on nothing but my own ignorance. And I said things that were hurtful and dismissive of service and sacrifice I can't begin to understand. Her voice was shaky but seemed sincere. I think I've been intimidated by you since Derek and I got married. You were this person who lived this completely different kind of life, doing things I couldn't understand, going places I'd never go. And instead of being curious about that or trying to understand it, I dismissed it as not valuable because it didn't fit my definition of success. That says terrible things about me as a person. I did not respond immediately because I wanted to make sure I was reacting to what she was actually saying rather than accepting a surface apology designed to smooth things over. She seemed genuinely remorseful rather than just embarrassed, but it was hard to tell whether this represented real growth or temporary discomfort that would fade once the immediate crisis passed. I appreciate the apology, I said finally, but I need you to understand that this wasn't just about today. This has been building for months. Every comment about my job being beneath me, every suggestion that I need to get my life together, every implication that my military service was some kind of phase I should be over now. It accumulated into feeling unwelcome at gatherings that are supposed to be about family. Sienna nodded, tears starting again. I know. Derek has been very clear about that in the conversation we just had. He's furious with me, and he should be. I've been treating you terribly while telling myself I was just being funny or honest or helpful. I was none of those things. I was being judgmental and small. She set down the plate she was holding and turned to face me directly. I don't expect you to forgive me immediately or trust that I've changed based on one apology. But I want you to know that I'm going to work on being better. My dad already told me he's disappointed in me, and that's honestly worse than him being angry. He raised me to be better than this. Your dad is a good man, I said. He didn't have to intervene the way he did. He absolutely did have to because nobody else was going to. He told me that one of the things he's always tried to teach me is that you judge character by how people treat those who can't benefit them or retaliate against them. By that measure, I've been showing terrible character. She wiped her eyes. I'm going to do better. That's all I can promise. It was not a perfect reconciliation, and I remained uncertain whether this represented genuine transformation or temporary guilt. But it was more honesty and self-awareness than I had expected from Sienna, and it felt like a starting point. Okay, I said. We'll see how it goes. We finished cleaning up together in more comfortable silence, and when we returned to the main gathering, the party was clearly winding down. Guests were collecting their things and saying goodbyes, the energy of the afternoon dissipating into evening quiet. James and Patricia approached me together as I was preparing to leave. We'll text you tomorrow about dinner, Patricia said, giving me a warm hug. I'm looking forward to spending more time with you. James shook my hand with formal precision. It was an honor to meet you, Raven. Thank you for your service, and I mean that sincerely. What you did mattered. Those simple words, coming from someone whose opinion carried weight because he truly understood what I had done, affected me more than I expected. Thank you, sir. That means more than you know. As I drove home to my modest apartment, I reflected on how completely the afternoon had transformed from where it began. I had arrived expecting to endure another gathering where I felt dismissed and invisible, and instead I had been forced into visibility in the most uncomfortable way possible before having that visibility validated by someone who actually understood. The experience left me feeling raw and exposed but also strangely lighter, as if a weight I had been carrying without fully acknowledging it had been lifted. For months I had been absorbing dismissal and telling myself it did not matter, that I did not need family validation, that I was fine on my own. And while those things were partially true, the reality was that being seen and valued by people who were supposed to be family did matter, and pretending otherwise had been costing me more than I realized. I thought about James Mitchell's command that I stop saying things were okay when they were not, and I recognized it as permission to acknowledge my own needs and feelings rather than constantly minimizing them for the comfort of others. It was a small shift in perspective, but it felt significant. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek. Thank you for staying. I know that wasn't easy. Let's get coffee this week, just the two of us. I want to hear about your life without Sienna or anyone else there. You deserve better from your family, and I'm going to start providing that. I smiled at the message and replied with agreement. The afternoon had been brutal in many ways, but it had also cracked open possibilities for more authentic connection with people I had been keeping at arm's length out of self-protection. As I settled into my quiet apartment, I felt the first stirrings of something I had not experienced in months since separating from the military. Hope. Not for dramatic transformation or perfect family relationships, but for the smaller possibility that I might be able to build connections that saw me clearly and valued me authentically, and that perhaps the transition I was navigating might lead somewhere worth going after all. The following morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that Northern California summer days often bring. Sunlight streaming through my apartment windows and illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily in the still air. I woke earlier than necessary for a Sunday, my internal clock still calibrated to military schedules despite 18 months of civilian life attempting to reset it. The events of the previous day played through my mind in fragmented sequences as I made coffee and stood at my kitchen window overlooking the parking lot of my apartment complex. The barbecue had ended on a note that felt almost surreal in its departure from every previous family gathering I had attended since moving back to Sacramento. I had left Derek's house with phone numbers exchanged, dinner plans made with the Mitchells, and a sense that something fundamental had shifted in how I existed within my family's awareness. But morning brought with it the analytical clarity that had served me well during my military career, and I found myself examining the previous day's events with less emotion and more strategic assessment. James Mitchell's intervention had been powerful and necessary, forcing an acknowledgement of my service and capabilities that had been conspicuously absent from family interactions. But interventions created by external authority figures were not sustainable foundations for ongoing relationships. His presence had compelled behavior change, but the real test would be whether that change persisted once he and Patricia returned to Virginia, and I was left navigating family dynamics without his commanding presence to enforce respect. Sienna's apology had seemed genuine in the moment, emerging from what appeared to be authentic shame and self-reflection prompted by her father's disappointment. But apologies offered under duress and in the immediate aftermath of public humiliation were easy. The meaningful measure would be whether her behavior actually changed over time, whether she made sustained effort to understand me rather than dismiss me, whether she could maintain respect when it was no longer being actively monitored and enforced. Derek's commitment to being more present and engaged in my life was perhaps the most promising development, but it too would require sustained follow-through rather than temporary guilt-driven attention. My brother and I had spent our adult lives in largely separate spheres, maintaining the kind of surface-level sibling connection that required minimal effort from either party. Transforming that into something more substantial would require intentional work from both of us, and I remained uncertain whether either of us possessed the sustained motivation to make it happen. I was midway through these thoughts when my phone buzzed with an incoming text message. The name on the screen made me pause before opening it. Sienna. Maya. I know it's early, but I wanted to reach out before I lose courage. I've been awake most of the night thinking about yesterday, and about how I've treated you since you moved back here. I'm genuinely ashamed. I wondered if you'd be willing to meet for coffee this week, just the two of us. I'd like to actually get to know you rather than continuing to operate on the cartoon character version of you I created in my head. I understand if you're not interested, but I wanted to ask. No pressure either way. The message was notably different in tone from our usual interactions, lacking the performative cheerfulness that typically characterized Sienna's communication style. I read it 3 times, trying to assess authenticity while recognizing that text messages were imperfect vehicles for gauging genuine emotion versus strategic relationship management. Part of me wanted to decline, to maintain the protective distance I had established and avoid the vulnerability that would come with actually allowing Sienna access to my interior life. The easier path would be to accept her apology, maintain polite surface interactions at future family gatherings, and otherwise keep her at arm's length where she could not inflict further damage. But another part of me, the part that had spent 12 years in a career that required calculated risk-taking, recognized that meaningful relationships required willingness to risk being hurt again. I responded with careful neutrality. I appreciate you reaching out. I'm willing to meet for coffee. Wednesday afternoon works for me if that fits your schedule. Let me know where and when. Her response came within seconds, suggesting she had been waiting anxiously for my reply. Wednesday is perfect. There's a coffee shop called Bridge Street Cafe near the river. Does 2 o'clock work? Thank you for being willing to give me a chance to do better. I confirmed the time and location, then set my phone down and returned to my coffee with mixed feelings about the commitment I had just made. The version of myself that had existed before military service would have been more naturally trusting, more willing to assume good intentions and give people unlimited chances to improve. 12 years of intelligence work had recalibrated those instincts considerably, teaching me to assess patterns of behavior rather than stated intentions, to trust evidence over promises, and to protect vulnerabilities from exploitation. The tension between wanting to believe in people's capacity for growth and having learned through hard experience that many people do not actually change created a constant internal negotiation about how much trust to extend and how quickly. I recognized this as one of the challenges of transition that nobody had adequately prepared me for during separation counseling. The military had trained me to think in terms of threat assessment, contingency planning, and strategic protection of assets. Civilian life required vulnerability, trust, and acceptance of uncertainty in ways that felt fundamentally at odds with the survival mechanisms I had developed. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Derek. "Hey, are you free for coffee this morning? I know it's short notice, but I'd really like to talk. Sienna is visiting her mom for the day, so we could actually have an uninterrupted conversation." I agreed to meet him at a diner we had gone to occasionally during my visits home on leave, a place that served excellent breakfast and maintained the kind of comfortable, worn atmosphere that made extended conversation easy. I arrived to find Derek already there, occupying a corner booth and staring into a cup of coffee with the expression of someone who had also spent a largely sleepless night processing uncomfortable revelations. He looked up when I slid into the booth across from him, and I was struck by how tired he looked. My brother had always maintained the kind of carefully managed appearance that his corporate career required, but this morning he looked rumpled and stressed in ways that were uncharacteristic. "Thanks for meeting me," he said without preamble. "I needed to talk to you without an audience and without Sienna present. Not because I'm hiding anything from her, but because I wanted you to feel free to be honest without worrying about her feelings." A server appeared to take my order, providing a brief interruption before Derek continued. "I had a long conversation with Sienna last night after everyone left. Actually, several long conversations that went until about 3 in the morning. It was not comfortable, but it was necessary." He wrapped his hands around his coffee mug as if seeking warmth despite the summer heat outside. "I realized yesterday that I've been avoiding difficult conversations with my wife about how she treats people, specifically about how she treats you, because it was easier to tell myself she didn't mean anything by her comments than to address the underlying attitudes driving them. That was cowardice on my part, and it contributed to creating an environment where you felt unwelcome at your own family gatherings." "What did she say?" I asked carefully. "A lot of things. Some defensive, some genuinely remorseful, some revealing about her own insecurities that I hadn't fully understood were driving her behavior." Derek paused, clearly trying to organize his thoughts. "Sienna grew up with a lot of advantages, and one consequence of that is she developed a fairly narrow definition of what success looks like. When she encounters people who don't fit that template, particularly people who have achieved significant things through completely different paths, it triggers defensiveness that manifests as dismissal." He looked at me directly. "You intimidate her, Maya. She would never have admitted that before yesterday, but it's true. You've done things she can't comprehend, survived experiences she's never had to face, developed capabilities she doesn't possess." Her way of managing that intimidation was to diminish your accomplishments and categorize your choices as less valuable than the path she's familiar with. It's an ego protection mechanism, but that doesn't excuse it. This perspective reframed Sienna's behavior in ways I had not previously considered. I had interpreted her dismissiveness as straightforward contempt rather than recognizing it might be rooted in her own discomfort with things she did not understand. The reframing did not excuse the harm caused, but it did make the behavior slightly more comprehensible as something other than simple cruelty. "Did she actually say I intimidate her? Or is that your interpretation?" I asked. "She said it explicitly. She said that every time we have a family gathering and you're there, she feels inadequate because she can't relate to your experience and she doesn't know how to talk to you. Instead of acknowledging that as her own limitation and trying to bridge it through curiosity and genuine interest, she's been managing it through dismissal and mockery. She's ashamed of that pattern now that it's been made visible." Derek took a long drink of coffee before continuing. I also realized last night that I've been complicit in creating a marriage dynamic where Sienna's perspective dominates because it's easier to defer to her than to push back. She has strong opinions about most things, and I've gotten in the habit of just agreeing or staying silent rather than offering alternative viewpoints. That's been unfair to both of us because it means she's operating in an echo chamber where her assumptions go unchallenged, and I'm not actually showing up as a full partner in the relationship. This was a level of marital introspection I had not expected from Derek, and it suggested the previous day's events had catalyzed more than just surface-level apologies. He looked genuinely troubled in ways that indicated real self-examination rather than temporary discomfort. "Where does this leave things between you and Sienna?" I asked. "In a complicated place that's going to require ongoing work. She's committed to therapy, both individual and couples counseling, because we both recognized last night that some of these patterns are bigger than just how she treats you. They're about fundamental assumptions she makes about people and value and success that are limiting her ability to connect meaningfully with anyone who doesn't fit a narrow mold." He looked uncomfortable but continued. "Her dad was pretty harsh with her after most guests had left. He told her that he was disappointed in the person she's become, that he and Patricia didn't raise her to be dismissive and small-minded, and that she's been coasting on privilege without developing character. Coming from anyone else that might have rolled off, but her dad's opinion is one of the few things that genuinely affects her." The image of James Mitchell delivering this assessment to his daughter was both uncomfortable and somehow satisfying in its justice. Sienna had spent the barbecue being publicly confronted with the consequences of her behavior, but it seemed the private reckoning with her father afterward had been equally significant. "How are you doing with all of this?" I asked Derek. "It can't be easy to have your wife publicly humiliated, and then spend all night having difficult conversations about fundamental aspects of who she is as a person." Derek laughed without humor. "It's been one of the worst 24 hours of my marriage, honestly, but also maybe one of the most important. Sienna and I have been together for 6 years, married for 5, and I'm not sure we've ever had conversations as honest as the ones we had last night. We've been performing our marriage more than actually living it, maintaining surfaces without addressing anything substantive underneath. Yesterday cracked that open in ways that are uncomfortable but probably necessary." He leaned forward. "But I didn't ask you here to talk about my marriage problems. I asked you here because I needed to apologize to you directly without an audience, and to tell you that things are going to be different going forward. Not just in terms of how Sienna treats you, but in terms of how I show up as your brother." "Derek, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. Let me finish." His tone was firm. "I've been a terrible brother to you for years, Maya. Not actively cruel like Sienna, but passively absent in ways that are their own form of letting you down. When you were deployed, I told myself you were fine because that was easier than acknowledging that you were in danger and I was worried. When you came home on leave, I made surface-level conversation because asking real questions would have required emotional availability I wasn't prepared to offer. When you separated and moved back here, I welcomed you back to the area but made no real effort to understand what you were going through or what you needed." His voice was getting rougher. "You're my little sister. I remember when you were born, when you were a kid, when you left for basic training at 18. I remember being worried about you joining the military because I thought it was dangerous and I didn't want anything to happen to you. But then you were gone and I was busy with my own life, and it became easier to just not think too hard about what you were actually doing or what it was costing you. I never told you what I was doing," I pointed out. "Most of it was classified. You couldn't have known. I could have asked better questions. I could have educated myself about what intelligence analysts do, what deployment to combat zones means, what kind of stress that creates. I could have made it clear that even though I couldn't know specifics, I cared about your experience and was there to support you however I could. Instead, I asked generic questions, accepted vague answers, and went back to thinking about my own comfortable life." Derek pulled out his phone and opened something, then turned it toward me. On the screen was a web page about military intelligence operations, specifically about analysts who deploy forward with special operations units. "I spent 3 hours last night reading about what you actually did. Not specifics obviously because that's all classified, but general descriptions of the role, the environment, the operational tempo. Maya, you were living on forward operating bases that took regular enemy fire. You were providing real-time intelligence that directly affected whether operators lived or died. You did that for 12 years, 7 deployments, all in combat zones. He set the phone down. I should have known that. I should have cared enough to educate myself instead of remaining willfully ignorant because it was more comfortable. The fact that it took Commander Mitchell calling me out in my own backyard for me to actually do basic research about my sister's career is shameful. I did not know how to respond to this level of contrition. Derek and I had never had particularly emotional conversations. Our relationship had always been characterized by pleasant but surface-level interaction, the kind of sibling connection that was warm enough but not deeply intimate. This level of vulnerability and self-criticism was unprecedented. I appreciate you saying all of this, I managed finally. But I don't want you to flagellate yourself endlessly. You weren't deliberately trying to hurt me. You were just living your life, which is what people do. That's not good enough though. Living my life shouldn't mean being completely disengaged from my sister's life, especially when she's going through a major transition that I know from reading is statistically very difficult for veterans. He pulled out a small notebook, the kind he used for work meetings. I made a list last night of questions I should have asked you months ago but didn't. I'm going to ask them now, and I want real answers, not the polite deflections you usually give. I felt simultaneously touched and uncomfortable with this level of attentiveness. Part of me wanted to deflect anyway, to maintain the protective barriers I had built around difficult topics. But Derek was making genuine effort, and meeting that effort with continued evasion seemed counterproductive. Okay, I said carefully. Ask your questions. Derek opened the notebook. How are you actually doing with the transition? Not fine or it's an adjustment, but really, how are you handling it? I took a long breath, trying to formulate an honest answer to a question I had been avoiding, fully examining myself. It's harder than I expected. I thought I was prepared because I did all the transition assistance programs, I had a job lined up before I separated, I had a plan. But the reality of actually living civilian life after 12 years in the military is more disorienting than I anticipated. I miss the sense of purpose and mission. I miss working with people who understood what we were doing and why it mattered. I miss the clarity of knowing your role and function within a larger operation. I paused, recognizing I was articulating things I had not fully verbalized even to myself. The civilian world feels simultaneously too complicated and too simple. Too complicated because there are endless choices about how to structure your life and what to prioritize, and nobody tells you what the right answer is. Too simple because the stakes of most civilian concerns feel trivial compared to what I was doing before, and I struggle to generate appropriate emotional investment in things that feel inconsequential. Derek was writing notes, actually taking this seriously. Do you regret getting out? Sometimes. Not most of the time, but there are moments when I see updates from people still serving, or when I hear about operations happening in regions I know and I feel like I abandoned something important. Like I quit when I should have pushed through to retirement. I looked down at my coffee. But I also know I made the right decision for where I was at that point. I had given everything I could give, and staying would have damaged me in ways that weren't sustainable. What do you need that you're not getting? Derek asked. This question hit at the core of what I had been struggling with. Connection with people who understand what I experienced. Purpose that feels meaningful. Work that actually utilizes my capabilities. A sense that the transition is leading somewhere rather than just being permanent limbo in a life that doesn't quite fit. Are you in touch with other veterans who are also transitioning? Not really. I went to a few veteran networking events but found them awkward. Most of the veterans there were from different service branches and different career fields, and while we shared military experience broadly, the specific nature of what I did was different enough that I couldn't really talk about it in ways that created connection. There's also the complication that talking about intelligence work, even in general terms, tends to make people either overly interested in ways that feel voyeuristic or uncomfortable because they don't know how to respond. Derek nodded thoughtfully. What about the job? You told people yesterday it was intentionally low stress for your first civilian role, but is it sustainable long-term or is it just a placeholder until you figure out what you actually want to do? Honestly, I don't know. The job is fine. It pays adequately, it doesn't stress me out, and it gives me space to figure out civilian life without the additional pressure of a demanding career. But I'm aware that I'm significantly underemployed given my capabilities, and at some point that's going to become its own source of frustration. I just don't know yet what I want to do instead, or whether I have the energy to invest in building a new career when I'm still processing the loss of the old one. We talked for another hour, Derek working through his list of questions with the systematic thoroughness he brought to his work projects. He asked about my financial situation, my social life, whether I was dating anyone, what my long-term goals were, whether I had considered going back to school, what kind of support would actually be helpful versus what felt like empty gestures. Some questions I could answer easily, others required thought and articulation of things I had not previously examined closely. What emerged from the conversation was a portrait of someone who was functioning adequately on the surface while struggling significantly underneath, managing transition challenges through compartmentalization and isolation, rather than through connection and processing. It was not a comfortable self-assessment, but it felt accurate in ways that the more optimistic narratives I usually told myself did not. "I want to help," Derek said finally, "but I'm not entirely sure how to help beyond just being more present and engaged. What would actually be useful?" I considered this. Honestly, what happened yesterday was helpful in its own way. Having someone with credibility validate that my service mattered, having family dynamics shift so I'm actually seen rather than dismissed, those things address some of the isolation I've been feeling. What would be helpful going forward is sustained engagement rather than temporary attention. Check in regularly, ask real questions, include me in things where I might meet people outside my current limited social circle. Don't treat me like I'm fragile or broken, but also don't minimize that transition is genuinely difficult. "I can do that," Derek said firmly. "And I'm going to. Not just for a few weeks until this blows over, but ongoing. You're my sister and you deserve better than what I've been providing." We parted with an agreement to have weekly coffee meetings, just the two of us, where we could actually talk without the performance aspects of family gatherings or the complications of Sienna's presence. It felt like a genuine step toward building a more substantial sibling relationship, though I remained cautiously optimistic rather than fully convinced it would sustain. The rest of Sunday passed quietly. I did laundry, meal prepped for the week ahead, and spent several hours reading on my small balcony while trying not to obsessively replay the previous 24 hours. My phone buzzed periodically with messages from various people, Patricia Mitchell confirming dinner plans for Tuesday evening, my mother asking confusedly about some story she had heard third-hand about the BBQ, a former colleague from my last military assignment sending a random meme about intelligence work. That evening I received an unexpected call from Marcus, Derek's business partner, who had turned out to be a Marine veteran. We talked for nearly an hour about transition challenges, comparing experiences and commiserating about the difficulties of translating military capabilities into civilian contexts. He mentioned a veteran networking group that was specifically for people who had worked in intelligence or special operations adjacent roles, suggesting it might provide better connection than the general veteran groups I had tried. "The thing about intelligence work," Marcus said, "is that it's inherently isolating even when you're still in. You can't talk about what you do with most people, which means you learn to compartmentalize and keep things surface level. But that coping mechanism becomes a liability in transition because you need to actually connect with people and let them see who you are. It's a hard habit to break." This observation felt uncomfortably accurate. I had spent 12 years perfecting the art of pleasant surface-level interaction, while protecting classified information and operational security. Those skills had served me well in the military, but were actively hindering my ability to build meaningful civilian relationships. We ended the call with plans to meet for coffee later in the week, and I felt marginally less alone in the transition process. The previous day had been brutal in its public humiliation and forced vulnerability, but it had also cracked open possibilities for more authentic connection that I had been systematically avoiding. Monday morning I returned to work at the distribution company where my primary responsibilities involved optimizing shipping routes and managing logistics databases. The work was exactly as undemanding as I had described it to Derek, requiring perhaps 15% of my cognitive capacity, and providing none of the sense of purpose or mission that had characterized my military career. I moved through the day on autopilot, attending meetings about process improvements and responding to emails about inventory management, while my mind remained partly occupied with processing the weekend's events. My supervisor, a pleasant but not particularly perceptive man named Robert who managed our logistics team, stopped by my desk mid-afternoon to ask about my weekend. I provided the standard brief and positive response, mentioning family gathering without details, and he nodded absently before moving on to discuss a shipping delay that needed attention. The superficiality of the interaction highlighted what I had been explaining to Derek about civilian work feeling trivial. Robert was genuinely concerned about a shipment that would arrive 2 days late, treating it as a significant problem requiring immediate attention. I found it nearly impossible to generate appropriate concern about something so fundamentally inconsequential. That evening I attended a yoga class at the gym near my apartment, part of my ongoing effort to maintain physical fitness and manage stress through exercise. The class was full of people in expensive athleisure were discussing their days in voices that carried across the studio despite the supposedly meditative atmosphere. I heard conversations about difficult clients, annoying coworkers, frustrating commutes, and relationship drama, all delivered with the intensity of actual crises. I tried to generate compassion for their genuine experience of these difficulties, while internally struggling with the disconnect between their definition of hardship and my own reference points. The instructor, a serene woman in her 40s named Dawn who spoke in soothing tones about mindfulness and presence, led us through a series of poses while encouraging us to release whatever tensions we were carrying. I tried to engage with the practice sincerely, but found my mind wandering to the upcoming coffee meeting with Sienna and the dinner with the Mitchells, wondering whether these represented genuine opportunities for growth, or just temporary disruptions in the comfortable isolation I had been maintaining. Tuesday arrived with the anticipation of dinner with James and Patricia Mitchell creating low-level anxiety throughout my workday. I left the office precisely at 5, drove home to change into something more appropriate than my work clothes, and arrived at the restaurant they had selected with 10 minutes to spare. They were already there, seated at a corner table in a quietly upscale establishment that served contemporary American cuisine. Patricia stood to hug me as I approached, and James shook my hand with formal courtesy before gesturing for me to sit. "We're glad you could make it," Patricia said warmly. "We've been looking forward to actually getting to know you without the chaos of a party." What followed was 3 hours of the most substantive conversation I had had with anyone outside my former military colleagues in months. James asked detailed questions about my deployments, my role within intelligence operations, and my experience working with Special Operations Forces. His questions came from genuine understanding of the operational environment rather than civilian curiosity, and I found myself able to discuss aspects of my experience that I rarely could in unclassified settings. "The hardest part about intelligence work," James observed at one point, "is that you carry enormous responsibility for operational outcomes, but you rarely get to see those outcomes directly. You provide analysis that affects decisions that affect missions, but you're not on the mission yourself. That's a particular kind of stress that people who haven't done it don't understand." "Exactly," I said with relief at being understood. "And when things go right, the operators get credit, which is appropriate. But when intelligence is wrong or incomplete, analysts carry the weight of knowing their work might have contributed to casualties. You're responsible for outcomes you can't directly control, and that creates constant pressure to be perfect when perfect is impossible." Patricia asked about the experience of being a woman in military intelligence, and I found myself discussing dynamics I rarely articulated about navigating male-dominated spaces while trying to prove competence without being labeled difficult or aggressive. She listened with the attentiveness of someone genuinely interested rather than asking performative questions, and several times offered observations from her own experience in corporate leadership that paralleled military dynamics in surprising ways. The conversation ranged across topics from geopolitics to transition challenges to what constituted meaningful work, to how to build community outside institutional structures. James shared stories from his 30 years as a SEAL, including the difficulties he had faced when transitioning to civilian life after retirement. Patricia talked about her career in nonprofit management and the satisfaction she found in work that contributed to causes she cared about. Both of them treated me as an equal participant in adult conversation rather than as Derek's younger sister who needed to be accommodated or explained to. As dinner concluded and we prepared to leave, James fixed me with a serious look. "I want you to know that what I said at the barbecue wasn't just performative intervention. Your service matters. The work you did matters. The sacrifices you made matter. Don't let anyone, including yourself, diminish that." He paused before continuing. "I also want you to know that transition is hard for everyone, but it's particularly hard for people coming out of intensive operational environments. You're going to have days where you question whether you made the right decision, whether you should have stayed in, whether you'll ever find something that feels as meaningful as what you left. That's normal. But I promise you that there is life after military service that can be fulfilling in different ways. It just takes time to find it. Patricia added. And you don't have to find it alone. We'd like to stay in touch after we go back to Virginia. Email, phone calls, whatever works. Jim has a whole network of people who have transitioned out of special operations and intelligence work, and he can make introductions if you're open to that. Sometimes it helps to talk with people who have walked the path before you. I felt emotion rising in my throat and had to blink several times before responding. Thank you. Both of you. This evening has meant more than I can adequately express. As I drove home that night, I reflected on how the barbecue incident that had felt so humiliating in the moment had somehow catalyzed a series of interactions that were addressing needs I had not fully acknowledged I had. The forced visibility had been uncomfortable, but it had also created opportunities for genuine connection with people who saw me clearly and valued what they saw. Wednesday afternoon arrived with both anticipation and apprehension about the coffee meeting with Sienna. I arrived at Bridge Street Cafe slightly early and secured a table near the window overlooking the river. Sienna appeared precisely at 2 o'clock, looking uncharacteristically uncertain as she approached the table. What transpired over the next 2 hours would either begin a genuine transformation in our relationship or confirm that the barbecue incident had produced only surface-level change. Either way, I recognized that I was choosing vulnerability over protection, risk over safety, and possibility over comfortable isolation. The outcome remained to be seen, but for the first time in months, I felt something beyond resignation about my civilian life. I felt the possibility that building meaningful connections and finding purpose beyond military service might actually be achievable, rather than just theoretical aspirations I told myself to maintain hope. The transition was far from complete, but perhaps it was finally genuinely beginning. Sienna arrived at Bridge Street Cafe with an appearance that signaled intentionality in ways I had not previously associated with her. She wore minimal makeup compared to her usual carefully constructed aesthetic, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail rather than the elaborate styling that typically characterized her presentation. She carried a single notebook rather than the designer handbag that usually accompanied her everywhere, and her expression conveyed genuine nervousness rather than the social confidence she typically projected. She ordered coffee and sat down across from me with visible discomfort, taking several moments to organize her thoughts before speaking. The silence stretched between us, not hostile but weighted with the complexity of everything that had transpired at the barbecue and the uncertain foundation we were attempting to build from that wreckage. "Thank you for being willing to meet with me," Sienna began finally, her voice quieter than usual. "I know you didn't have to give me this opportunity, and I appreciate that you're here despite having every reason to tell me to leave you alone." I nodded acknowledgement but did not immediately respond, allowing space for her to continue. One thing military intelligence work teaches thoroughly is the value of silence in drawing out information and authentic communication. People will fill silence with truth when they feel compelled to explain themselves, whereas premature reassurance often allows them to retreat to comfortable superficiality. "I've spent the last 3 days doing a lot of thinking and some very uncomfortable self-examination," Sienna continued. "My dad told me after the barbecue that I've been coasting on privilege without developing character, and that assessment has been sitting with me in ways I can't ignore. He's right. I've spent my adult life in environments where my advantages were normalized and my perspective was constantly reinforced, and I never questioned whether that perspective was limited or harmful." She looked down at her untouched coffee. "I created a narrative about you based on almost no actual information. I decided you were aimless because you took a job below your capability level. I decided you were socially awkward because you didn't engage in conversations about topics you had no entry point into. I decided your military service was unremarkable because I had no framework for understanding what you actually did. And then I reinforced that narrative through commentary that was cruel regardless of whether it was accurate, which it wasn't." This level of self-awareness was more than I had anticipated from Sienna, though I remained cautious about whether it represented genuine transformation or temporary guilt that would fade once the immediate discomfort passed. People often express profound insights in the immediate aftermath of being confronted with their behavior, but sustained change requires more than momentary clarity. I appreciate your willingness to examine your behavior, I said carefully. But I need to be honest with you about something. I'm not interested in surface-level apologies or temporary behavior modification motivated by embarrassment. If we're going to have any kind of relationship going forward, it needs to be based on genuine respect and sustained effort rather than guilt-driven performance that will fade once your father goes back to Virginia and the immediate crisis passes. Sienna flinched slightly but nodded. That's fair. And honestly, that's what I'm trying to figure out. Whether I'm capable of being the kind of person who can actually respect and value people whose lives look different from mine, or whether I'm fundamentally too limited by my background and assumptions to grow beyond them. That's a question only you can answer through your actions over time, I replied. But I can tell you that I'm not interested in being your redemption project or the vehicle through which you prove to your father that you've learned something. If you want to know me, it needs to be because you're genuinely curious about who I am, not because getting to know me will earn you approval from people whose opinions matter to you. I understand that. Sienna took a drink of her coffee, clearly gathering courage for something. Can I ask you some questions? Real questions about your life and your service and your experience, not polite small-talk questions designed to appear interested without actually engaging. I considered this request. Part of me wanted to maintain protective distance, to refuse vulnerability with someone who had demonstrated willingness to weaponize information into mockery. But another part recognized that growth requires risk, and that refusing all vulnerability with people who had hurt me would ensure I remained isolated indefinitely. You can ask, I said finally. I reserve the right not to answer if questions venture into classified territory or topics I'm not comfortable discussing, but you can ask. What followed was 2 hours of conversation that felt fundamentally different from any previous interaction Sienna and I had shared. She asked about my decision to join the military at 18, about what basic training and technical school had been like, about how I had ended up in intelligence work and what had made me good at it. She asked about deployment experiences in ways that demonstrated she had done research about combat zones and operational environments, preparing herself to understand context, rather than asking from complete ignorance. I found myself sharing more than I had anticipated, partly because her questions came from genuine curiosity, rather than voyeuristic interest in dramatic stories. She asked about the psychological challenges of intelligence work, about how I had managed stress and isolation, about what it felt like to know that analysis I provided might affect life and death decisions. She asked about being a woman in male-dominated environments, about relationships that had failed under the pressure of military life, about what I had sacrificed and whether I believed those sacrifices had been worth it. I don't know if the sacrifices were worth it in some ultimate cosmic accounting, I said at one point. But I know the work mattered while I was doing it. I know I contributed to operations that saved American lives and advanced national security objectives. I know I developed capabilities and perspectives I wouldn't have gained any other way. Whether that balances against failed relationships and accumulated stress and missing 12 years of normal life progression is not something I can calculate neatly. Sienna was taking notes periodically in her notebook, which I found both flattering and slightly uncomfortable. Why are you writing things down? I asked. Because I want to remember, she said simply. I want to be able to reference back to what you've told me rather than relying on my memory, which has proven unreliable when it comes to actually retaining information about people I should care about. I'm trying to be intentional about this rather than just hoping good intentions will magically translate into sustained behavior change. This struck me as more thoughtful than I had expected. Sienna was approaching the conversation with the kind of systematic attention she typically reserved for her work projects, treating relationship repair as something requiring actual strategy and documentation rather than just emotional expression. Can I ask you something that might be uncomfortable? Sienna said after a pause. You can ask. Do you have PTSD? I know I made that horrible joke at the barbecue, but I'm asking genuinely now. Not because I want to categorize you or feel sorry for you, but because if you do, I want to understand what that means and how it affects you so I don't inadvertently say or do things that make it worse. The question was more direct than most people would dare to be, and I appreciated the straightforwardness even as I grappled with how to answer honestly. The clinical diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder had never been formally applied to me during my military service, largely because I had never sought mental health treatment while on active duty out of concern it might affect my security clearance or my ability to deploy with my units. Since separating, my therapist and I had discussed whether my symptoms met diagnostic criteria, ultimately concluding that I exhibited some PTSD symptoms without meeting the full diagnostic threshold. I have some symptoms that are consistent with PTSD, I said carefully. Hypervigilance, difficulty sleeping, intrusive thoughts about certain experiences, heightened startle response. But I don't have the full constellation of symptoms that would warrant a formal diagnosis, and I'm managing what I do have through therapy and stress management techniques. It affects me in ways that are mostly invisible to other people, but it does affect me. Like what? What does that look like in practical terms? Like being unable to sit with my back to a door in restaurants because it triggers anxiety about not being able to see potential threats entering the space. Like having difficulty being in crowded places where I can't easily track everyone's positions and movements. Like occasionally having moments where something triggers a memory of a deployment experience, and I briefly disconnect from present surroundings. Like having a baseline level of tension that never fully releases even in objectively safe environments. I paused, deciding whether to share something more personal. Like dropping a dish of potato salad at a barbecue because my hands were shaking from adrenaline response to being publicly mocked, and then standing there unable to move or speak because my nervous system was treating social humiliation as a threat requiring fight or flight response. Sienna closed her eyes briefly, pain visible in her expression. God, Maya, I'm so sorry. I didn't understand what I was seeing or what I was contributing to. I just saw you drop something and made a cruel joke without recognizing that I had caused a stress response that led to the physical clumsiness I then mocked. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty, I said, though part of me recognized that was not entirely true. I'm telling you because you asked what it looks like in practical terms. That's what it looks like. Stress responses that emerge in contexts where other people wouldn't be stressed, physical manifestations of psychological patterns developed through years of operating in genuinely dangerous environments, difficulty recalibrating threat assessment to match civilian reality. We sat in silence for a moment before Sienna spoke again. What can I do to be helpful rather than harmful? Specifically, what behaviors or approaches from me would actually support you rather than making things harder? This question demonstrated more emotional intelligence than I had credited Sienna with possessing, and I took time to consider it seriously. Don't treat me like I'm fragile or broken. Don't walk on eggshells or constantly monitor whether you're saying the right thing. But also don't dismiss the reality that transition is difficult, and that I'm managing challenges you can't see. Ask questions when you're genuinely curious, but respect boundaries when I indicate something is not open for discussion. Don't make assumptions about what I need or what would be helpful, actually ask me. I continued. And most importantly, don't expect me to educate you about everything related to military service or PTSD or transition challenges. I'm willing to share my experience, but it's not my job to serve as your personal resource for understanding veterans. There are books, articles, documentaries, resources you can access on your own. Do that work yourself rather than expecting me to constantly explain things. Sienna nodded, writing notes. That makes sense. I've already started reading some books about military culture and transition, and I found a documentary series about women in combat roles that I'm working through. I should have done this years ago when Derek and I got married and I was joining a family that included someone with military experience. Why didn't you? I asked. She looked uncomfortable but answered honestly. Because I didn't think it mattered. I assumed your military service was just something you had done, past tense, that didn't really affect who you were now or how I should relate to you. I didn't understand that military service, especially the kind of intensive service you did, fundamentally shapes people in ways that don't disappear when you take off the uniform. I was ignorant, and I maintained that ignorance because I didn't care enough to educate myself. The admission was stark in its honesty, and I found myself appreciating Sienna's willingness to articulate her previous failures without softening them into more comfortable narratives. She was not trying to excuse herself or explain away her behavior. She was simply acknowledging what had been true. So where do we go from here? Sienna asked. I know I can't undo the past several months of being dismissive and hurtful. I know I can't earn your trust back immediately through one coffee conversation and some reading assignments I've given myself. But I want to do better, and I'm asking what that looks like in practical terms. I thought about James Mitchell's command at the barbecue that I stop saying things were okay when they were not, and I recognized this as a moment to practice that directive. Here's what I need from you. I need you to stop making comments about my job, my life choices, or my social habits that carry implicit judgment about whether I'm doing civilian life correctly according to your standards. I need you to recognize that my path doesn't have to look like yours to be valid. I need you to stop treating me like a project that needs fixing or a person who needs saving from myself. I paused to collect my thoughts before continuing. I need you to include me in family gatherings without commentary about whether I'm participating correctly or engaging enough with other guests. If I'm quiet at a party, that's okay. If I leave early, that's okay. If I don't want to attend something, that's okay. My presence or absence shouldn't require explanation or justification, and it shouldn't be treated as a referendum on my social capability or mental health. Sienna was writing rapidly, and I appreciated that she was taking this seriously rather than just nodding along without retaining specifics. I also need you to recognize that my relationship with Derek is separate from my relationship with you, I continued. He's my brother, and I'm working on building a better connection with him. That doesn't automatically extend to you, and you trying to insert yourself into our relationship or manage how he relates to me would not be helpful. Let us figure out our sibling dynamic without interference. Understood, Sienna said. Is there anything else? Yes. I need you to understand that I'm not responsible for managing your feelings about your behavior. You're going through some uncomfortable self-examination right now because your father called you out and because you're recognizing ways you've been hurtful. That discomfort is yours to process. Don't come to me seeking reassurance that you're not a bad person or asking me to absolve you of guilt. Work through that with your therapist, not with the person you hurt. This boundary felt important to establish clearly. I had watched too many situations where the person who had caused harm ended up being comforted by the person they had harmed, a dynamic that prioritized the feelings of the wrongdoer over the healing of the injured party. I was not interested in providing emotional labor to help Sienna feel better about having been cruel to me. That's fair, Sienna said quietly. I appreciate you being direct about these boundaries. It actually makes this easier because I know what you need rather than having to guess and potentially get it wrong. We talked for another 30 minutes about more neutral topics, including her work in marketing and some genuinely interesting projects she was working on for an environmental nonprofit that was trying to reach younger audiences. I found that when Sienna talked about work she was passionate about rather than performing social status, she was considerably more interesting and authentic than the persona she typically projected. As we prepared to leave, Sienna looked at me seriously. I know I've said this multiple times already, but I need to say it once more. I'm genuinely sorry for how I've treated you. Not just at the barbecue but for months before that. I was wrong in my assumptions, cruel in my commentary, and dismissive of service and sacrifice that deserves respect. I'm committed to doing better, and I hope over time I can prove that through actions rather than just words. I appreciate that, I said, meaning it more than I had expected to, and I'm willing to give this a chance. But I'm going to be honest with you about something. I don't trust you yet. Trust is earned through consistent behavior over time, not through apologies and good intentions. So I'm approaching this with cautious optimism rather than assuming everything is fixed because we had one good conversation. I understand that completely, Sienna replied. And honestly, I wouldn't trust me either if I were you. I'll work on earning that trust through action. We parted with a cordial but not effusive farewell, and I drove home feeling emotionally exhausted but cautiously hopeful that perhaps Sienna's transformation might be genuine. Only time would reveal whether this represented sustainable change or temporary performance that would fade once the pressure of immediate consequences receded. That evening I had a phone conversation with Patricia Mitchell that ranged across topics from our dinner earlier in the week to her observations about her daughter's current state of mind. Patricia was remarkably candid about Sienna's limitations, while also expressing hope that this crisis might catalyze genuine growth. Sienna has always been our most challenging child, Patricia said without rancor. Not because she was badly behaved, but because she was born into advantages that made it difficult for her to develop empathy for people whose experiences differed from hers. James and I tried to instill values of service and humility, but those lessons competed with a culture that constantly reinforced her centrality and importance. The result was someone who is genuinely talented and capable in many ways but also remarkably limited in her ability to see beyond her own perspective. She paused before continuing. I think what happened at the barbecue genuinely shocked her out of some of her complacency. Having her father publicly disappointed in her hit harder than any amount of private correction ever has. She respects James more than anyone else in her life, and knowing she let him down created a crisis that might actually produce lasting change. But you're right to be cautious. People can recognize their flaws without being willing to do the hard work of actually changing them. Over the following days, I found myself engaged in a recalibration of my relationship, not just with Sienna but with my entire approach to civilian life and family connection. The barbecue incident had functioned as a catalyst that forced visibility and vulnerability I had been avoiding, and the aftermath was requiring me to make active decisions about what kind of life I wanted to build rather than simply defaulting to isolated self-protection. Derek followed through on his commitment to weekly coffee meetings, and our second meeting felt less awkward than the first as we began establishing patterns of genuine communication. He asked substantive questions about my work and whether I was considering looking for something more challenging, about my social life, and whether I was meeting people outside my limited current circles, about my long-term goals and what success would look like for me in civilian life. These questions forced me to articulate things I had been avoiding examining too closely. The truth was that I had been in a holding pattern since separating from the military, telling myself I was taking time to decompress and adjust when what I was actually doing was avoiding the difficult work of building a new identity and purpose. The logistics job was fine as a temporary placeholder, but it was not a career, and I needed to start thinking seriously about what I actually wanted to do with the decades of civilian life ahead of me. Have you thought about going back to school? Derek asked during our third coffee meeting. You have GI Bill benefits, and getting a graduate degree might help you transition into work that actually utilizes your analytical capabilities. I had considered this option during transition planning but had dismissed it as requiring energy I was not sure I possessed. The idea of being a student again after 12 years in the professional world felt simultaneously appealing and exhausting. What would I study? I asked. Intelligence analysis doesn't translate neatly into civilian academic programs, and most of what I did is still classified enough that I couldn't discuss it in papers or dissertation research. What about international relations or security studies? Or data analytics, which is basically civilian intelligence work applied to business contexts? Derek was clearly giving this serious thought rather than offering casual suggestions. You could also look at programs in public policy or national security that would value your background without requiring you to disclose classified specifics. These were all reasonable suggestions that I had seen other transitioning intelligence professionals pursue with varying degrees of success. The challenge was that I remained uncertain whether I wanted to stay in fields adjacent to my military work, or whether I wanted to make a more dramatic pivot into something entirely different that would not constantly remind me of what I had left behind. I'll think about it, I said, which was as much commitment as I could manage in the moment. Right now I'm still trying to figure out who I am without the military defining me, and adding graduate school to that identity crisis seems potentially overwhelming. Derek nodded understanding. Fair enough. But don't let yourself stay in neutral indefinitely. At some point the comfortable holding pattern becomes its own trap. This observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy. I recognized that I had been telling myself I was taking necessary time to adjust when what I was actually doing was avoiding making decisions that would require commitment and risk. The military had provided clear structure and purpose, and I had been drifting in civilian life without replacing that structure with anything equally compelling. Marcus, Derek's business partner and fellow veteran, reached out midweek to invite me to a gathering of the veteran networking group he had mentioned. The group met monthly for informal socializing, and occasionally brought in speakers or organized professional development events. The upcoming gathering was purely social, just veterans getting together to share a meal and conversation without agenda or pressure. I debated whether to attend, still carrying ambivalence about veteran networking events based on previous awkward experiences. But Marcus promised this group was different, specifically oriented toward people who had worked in intelligence, special operations, or other specialized fields that created particular challenges in translation to civilian life. The conversation would come from shared understanding rather than having to constantly explain context. I agreed to attend, recognizing that continued isolation was not serving me well even if it felt safer than risking connection. The gathering was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at a casual restaurant that had a private room where approximately 20 veterans would convene. The weekend passed quietly. I had no family obligations and used the time to catch up on reading, exercise, and the kind of restorative solitude that remained necessary even as I was working to build more connection. Saturday evening I received a text from Sienna asking if I would be interested in joining her for a volunteer event the following month with the environmental nonprofit she worked with. The invitation felt appropriate rather than pushy, offering an option without expectation, and I responded that I would consider it and let her know. Sunday afternoon James Mitchell called, ostensibly to check in but really to offer perspective on transition that came from his own experience leaving the SEALs after 30 years. We talked for over an hour about the psychological challenges of no longer being defined by military service, about finding meaning in civilian work after the intensity of special operations, about rebuilding identity around something other than mission and unit. The thing nobody tells you about transition, James said, is that you're not just changing careers. You're grieving the loss of an entire way of being in the world. You're mourning the person you were in uniform even as you're trying to figure out who you're going to be without it. That grief is real and it takes time to process, but most people won't understand it because from the outside it looks like you're just changing jobs. His words articulated something I had been feeling without naming. I was grieving not for something that had died but for something that had ended while I was still alive. The version of myself that had existed in the military was gone, and I was struggling to construct a civilian self that felt equally substantial and purposeful. How long did it take you to feel like yourself again after you retired? I asked. About 3 years before I felt like I had found solid ground, James said honestly. And even now, 10 years later, there are moments when I miss it. Miss the teams, miss the mission, miss the clarity of purpose. But I also have a life now that's fulfilling in different ways. It's just different, not worse. It took me time to accept different as valid rather than constantly comparing civilian life to military life and finding it wanting. This conversation provided more comfort than any transition counseling I had received during separation processing. James understood from lived experience rather than clinical training, and his willingness to be honest about the duration and difficulty of the process validated that my own struggle was normal rather than indicating failure. Monday I returned to work with renewed awareness of how inadequate my current employment was for long-term satisfaction. I moved through my tasks with mechanical efficiency, while beginning to research graduate programs and alternative career paths that might provide more meaningful engagement. The research felt productive in ways that simply accepting my current situation had not, even though I was not yet ready to make concrete commitments. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.